Hi there. Today we're going to start talking about the self and what is the self. We're going to break this up into three chunks. Basically, who am I? How do we define the self? Self-knowledge, how much do we know about ourselves? And self-control, how do we regulate ourselves? Okay? So what we're going to do is start talking this word self and skirting around the edges of it. Number one, a lot of people mistakenly believe that other people are watching them. Okay? Do you remember the high school kid that has a pimple and believes that everybody's staring at the pimple when in fact they are not staring at the pimple? Well, in this little study that happened here, they took a student and gave him a Barry Manilow shirt. Okay, there's Barry Manilow. He was not cool. All right, well, come on, at the copa, yeah, whatever. So what happens is that they wore the shirt into class. They come out and they're asked, how many people do you think saw you wearing that shirt? And they're great. At least half of the kids in the class saw me wearing the shirt. Fact is, 23% saw it. That's it. Okay, so far more than the estimation was far higher. And in a similar way, this illusion of transparency is this notion that whatever I'm feeling inside will show itself on the outside and others will be able to read it and see it. Okay? And so it's like this, ladies. We men do not have the ability to read your mind. If you are upset about something, tell us. We will not be able to read it. We are dumb that way. Okay? So use your words and tell us, please. Thank you. Okay. The self-concept. This is an important idea. And this is this notion that it's the answer basically to the question, who am I? In the 20 statements test, what happens is people are asked, okay, I'm going to simply say I am, and your job is to fill in the rest of the sentence. And I'll repeat 20 times. That's why it's called the 20 statements test. And so if you can do this without editing yourself, without making conscious efforts, you can find that the answers that you come up with towards the beginning are probably more meaningful on part of you than answers that come later in the list. So, yeah, I might say, oh, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a professor, and right off the top of my head, these are the I ams. But by the time I get down to 20, I'm like, I am a guy that loves trees. I don't know. And so all of a sudden, once you get closer to the bottom, you're clearly not as important in defining your sense of self. Okay? So what we find is that your brain has areas responsible for thinking about the self. Your thoughts about yourself are stored in ways that are different than thoughts about others. So you put the right hemisphere to sleep and you look in a mirror and you're like, well, I mean, I know who it is. I know it's me, but it's not me. I don't feel it. Huh? Or if you take the medial, that is when you have thoughts about yourself, the medial prefrontal cortex, a pathway in the medial prefrontal cortex will activate. Okay, so there's very specific brain activity responsible for thoughts of the self. Okay, so we can come across self schemas, and self schemas are, well, let me step back to more of a cognitive orientation. We have schemas that help us organize and understand the world. So, for example, I have a schema of restaurants, okay? So in my schema of a restaurant, there will be salt and pepper on the table, and there will be napkins and forks and plates and etc. And so now, when I go to a restaurant, I'm going to use this schema to organize the way I think and remember in the memories of the restaurant. Well, we find that that we have these schemas about restaurants, but we also have schemas about ourselves. And these schemas about ourselves might be, you might have a schema about yourself of an excellent student or something. And so when you look back on your memories of a time when you didn't do so well in school, you may remember differently than it really was, because you're going to be guided not necessarily by the event itself, but by your memory based on the schema. Okay? Well, this idea of there's specific brain areas in relation to the self, it turns out that the self-reference effect is the idea that We have the ability to remember things better when it relates to ourselves. Okay, so it's like if we ask to compare yourself in the story, compare the character in the story to yourself. Later on, you remember more about the character, right? It's just straightforward. But our sense of self is actually quite interesting because we can think about ourselves as existing in time. We can think about past self, present self, future self, possible selves, a dream of what you might be, what you might become, or a fear in this case. In fact, if you all remember on Carl Rogers' humanistic therapy, I'm not a humanistic therapist. I'm pulling therapy out for a second. Forgive me. So basically, at the beginning of therapy, you describe your ideal self, and then you describe your actual self, and then you look at the difference between my actual self and my ideal self. And the goal of therapy is to shrink the difference between these two. All right, I know I have simplified a very complex thing, but substantially that's the idea: to imagine what you want to be and get there. Okay. Our social self is defined in a lot of ways, the roles we play. Okay. As a father, let's say, for example, I had some attitudes towards fast cars. When I was younger, oh man, they are so cool, fast. Oh yeah, that is so cool. Now, I take on the role of a father. Now, my attitudes towards fast cars have clearly changed. I see one of these idiots on the road, and I'm like, come on, moron, there's little children out here, okay? And because of my role as a father, my attitudes towards fast cars have radically changed, okay? So we also define our social self based on social comparisons, and this can be problematic if you compare yourselves to the wrong people. A couple of years ago, I was on a vacation in Massachusetts, and my wife, for some odd reason, wanted to go out to Nantucket Island. Okay, I wasn't a big fan of this, but we took a ferry out from New Bedford, Massachusetts, out to Nantucket Island. And I'll tell you what happens is out on Nantucket Island, it's like the minimum wealth you must have to live there is like $50 million. That's like the minimum you can have. And so every house was this mega mansion. I have never felt more poor in my life than going out there. I felt miserable when I was out on Nantucket. I could not wait to get off of Nantucket because the social comparisons were impossible to ignore. So as we see, this whole notion of self, okay, can be composed of the self-concept, self-esteem. All of these aspects of the self can merge together. But I want to take a second to point out that this notion of the self and interest in studying the self didn't arise until humanistic psychology became popular. It was only under humanistic psychology that this notion of the self emerged. And so we find that this notion and emphasis on this notion of the self can often lead to selfish. Okay? Now, with that being said, we find that not everybody thinks the same way we do on this. Okay? Now, we in America have this notion of the self that is based on this idea that we have an existence separate from other people, that somehow I'm isolated and different. Remember on the 20 statements test, I say, I am tall, I am smart, I am strong, something like that. These are individual characteristics of me that define me as an individual different from others. But people that come from more collectivistic countries, which is pretty much, see, individualistic nations equals the United States, Europe, and let's see, Canada, and Australia, and New Zealand, in other words, all the former Brits, right? So, other parts of the world like Asia, Middle East, Africa, Central America, South America are much more collectivistic. And so, again, when they take the 20 statements test, they're far more likely to say, I am a son, okay? I am a student. And they define themselves based on these social roles they play. And so all of a sudden, what we find, just as an interesting image, well, it's down here somewhere. Interesting image right there. So here in the West, we tend to be individualists. We tend to have an independent view of the self. And so you see that the definition of the self on the left side here is isolated. It's an all on its own. Because remember, I am tall, I am strong, I am smart. These are characteristics that I own. I do not own these characteristics because of other people. It is mine. Even if all of these other people disappeared, I would still have these characteristics. Whereas on the right, the interdependent view of the self, if you define yourself in terms of, I am a son, I am a student, things like this, I am a colleague. And so all of a sudden, if you define yourself with these relationship terms, then as you can see, you're defining yourself as a son based on your overlap with your parents. And so it's one of these things where if you're on the left side and let's say one of your friend moves away, I wish my friend didn't move away, but fundamentally, has myself changed? No, myself has not changed when my friend moved away. Look at the image on the right. See, what happens is if friend moves away, a piece of you disappears. Okay? You have fundamentally lost a piece of yourself. And it's just a radically different way to think about this. And by the way, we find this to be in advertisements. Look at this. Korean advertisements tend to show people together, whereas American ones tend to show strong individual accomplishments. Okay? Collectivistic and individualistic cultures have some really, really interesting characteristics. We find, like, in America, we find superiority and pride. These are really good emotions in America. But in interdependent nations or collectivistic nations, happiness comes from like engaged feelings of respect for each other and things like this. So you've got individually based emotions creating happiness versus collectivistic based emotions to create happiness. So there's a lot of different things in collectivistic nature, extended families. In individualistic families, do you know what? I teach my children independence. I taught that from the earliest age. I thought it was hugely important that they learn to be an independent person. So let me explain this idea. This is a powerful difference. My wife is, as I may have mentioned, from Korea, so she comes from a collectivistic nation, and I, of course, am from America. So when I was first starting dating my wife, I was telling her about one of my role models. Somebody was my great-grandmother. Okay, now my great-grandmother, she became a widow in 1976. All right, so she was living in her own apartment. She was legally blind. She had knee problems and stuff. Well, her kids would come every single day to her apartment and make sure that they got the mail and read to her and helped her with the laundry and the things she couldn't do. But fundamentally, she had her own apartment. And then somewhere around 1986, it was about 86, she got sick, all right? She got some issues, and they put her into an assisted living center. And now the doctors at the assisted living center are saying, this is pretty much going to be the new normal, okay? Esther was her name, okay? Esther, this is going to be the new normal. And my grandma says, no. Her children are like, Mom, you got to, we can't afford the rent on that apartment. You're just, look, the doctor's saying you're not going back to that apartment. And my grandma goes, yes, I am, okay? And she did. It was like 6 months, and she got out of that thing. She went back to her apartment, and she lived there by herself to the day she died, okay? Now, I hear this as a strong story, a story of strong strength, independence, courage, all right? So I say she lived alone until the day she died, and my wife, again, coming from a collectivistic society, says, so she was lonely. Wait, where did you get the word lonely from? I never used the word lonely. I said lived alone. Yeah, lonely, says my wife. And I'm like, wait, what? Because you can't possibly imagine being alone and not being lonely. Okay? And in fact, my wife says, oh my goodness, your uncle, or her children are sons of bitches. How dare they allow their old mother to live by herself? And I'm like, no, my grandmother would have died if she would have had to move in with her children. And she would have hated that. And this is really the difference between collectivistic and individualistic cultures in a nutshell. Well, when looking at this dimension of individualism and collectivism, there's been more recent research showing that it's not just along a continuum. You know, some people are more individualistic, some are more collectivistic, but there's a second dimension of horizontal and vertical. And the vertical dimension refers to power, what was it? Emphasizes freedom, but not equality. That's right. So the vertical dimension emphasizes different emphasizes some are supposed to have more than others. Okay, the horizontal dimension is much more equality oriented. Okay, and so we can be vertical individualists where we're like we stress individualism and we believe that there's supposed to be inequality. But we can have horizontal individualism. I exist as a separate entity, but I believe that we should have uh, we should have differences between people. And so it's just really, really interesting, but we're not going to care that much. As long as you got the basic idea of individualism and collectivism and how it leads to the interdependent versus independent sense of self, that'll be enough for us. Okay. But here is a couple of words to describe. Well, here's another kind of way about it. You see, what happens is that in Japan, right? Japan, a very collectivistic nation, they have an old proverb that says, "The nail that sticks up will be pounded back down." In other words, don't stick out from others. Okay. Here in America, we have an old proverb that says, "The squeaky wheel gets the grease." If you want to get something done, make yourself stand out, right? Wow. I mean, these two proverbs are just like night and day. And yet, these are guiding principles in the way we live our lives. Okay? When describing the image on this aquarium scene here on the left, when Americans described it, they tend to describe each individual object. Well, there's a fish and a second fish and a third fish. But when Asians were describing the same scene, they tend to describe not one, two, three individual fish, but the relationships among the fish and the different objects in the environment. Oh, there's a larger fish swimming above a small fish. Okay, interesting. So even in this silly little description, they could not isolate these fish as individual elements. Okay? And on the right side, it was a silly study. You know, fill out a little survey. Now, as a reward, take a pen, right? And imagine you've got this layout of pens. Guess which one American people choose? All right, the red one. Okay, and guess which one Asians tend to choose? One of the green ones. Okay, so we as Americans want to stick out and be different. Okay. And by the way, they repeated it where it was 4 red pens and 1 green one, and then of course the Americans wanted whatever was the weird one, right? Whatever was different from the others. So pretty cool idea. And so wrapping it up, where is it? There. The self-concept yeah, you can read these things. This is just a nice summarization. Differences, yeah. Brief guide to avoiding international misunderstanding. Yeah, that's a good one. North Americans, oh my goodness, yes. North Americans use eye contact. Asians tend not to use contact. Yeah, we tend not to be touch-oriented. I like it. Okay, so I'm going to leave it with that, and I'll come back with self-knowledge in a little while. Maybe now, maybe not. I'm in my car. It's getting hot. Okay, so for now, it's a ta-ta. TTFN, right? Ta-ta.